happily welcome you all to the 2022 workshop on embodied cognition and dance. And this is the public component. So hello online, we're super happy to have you. What we've been doing here in the room all day is that we've been moving together and talking and doing different exercises. And this is sort of the little bit more formal component. So I want to introduce Michael Kimmel. He is, I want to say he's a good friend of mine, actually, even though we've never met in person, but we've been Skyping, Zooming a lot and talking and exchanging ideas. And the way that I found out about Michael and his work is that I was doing my dissertation, and then every time I would read an article of Michael's, I say, man, he just has all of my ideas. He did it already. So now I gotta do something else. And it is just such rich empirical work mixed with philosophy and psychology and a little bit of computer science and some integrative methods. And it's just very fantastic stuff. And he's sort of mixing it with working with dancers, working with martial artists, and very much taking serious the practice and what they're saying. And he does a lot of sort of mixing phenomenology with video observation and with cognitive science more broadly. And it's just always a pleasure to read all 45 pages that he will send me, right? So Michael will say, hey, you want to read something of mine? I say, yeah, I'll give you some comments. And then he sends me 50 pages, but it's 50 pages of delight. So I'm very happy to do it every time. Michael is at the Cognitive Science Hub at the University of Vienna. And hopefully one day we'll all make it over there and say hi. But Michael, I'm going to give it over to you now. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your kind words as well. It's true, we get along famously, so I'm really looking forward to meeting you guys in person sometime soon. So yes, you've said all the essential things about me, and there's little left, perhaps apart from the aspect that I publish for cognitive scientists mostly, but I have a background as a social scientist as well, so that kind of shows in many ways in my approach, and I'll give you a feel for how I work today and topics I work on or have been working on in the past couple of years. I'll be trying to make it not too technical, but a bit of it will be cognitive theory, unavoidably perhaps. But feel free to interrupt me with immediate clarification questions if there are any. And as I understand it, we'll be having plenty of time after the talk itself for a broader discussion. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, super. So without further ado, here we go. I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on the kinds of projects we've been doing. I started with Tango Argentino, which is something I danced myself, and then a bit later on also studying contact improvisation dancers, as well as studying somatic therapists in Shiatsu and the Feldenkrais method. A quite rewarding project actually. And martial arts, as Kristen has mentioned, in Aikido as well as Tai Chi now, Tai Chi partner interaction. And we've recently added partner acrobatics. So we're kind of interested in all things interactional, if you like. Bodies in touch, not only interaction at a distance, but what happens when bodies get in touch with each other, start to communicate physically as well. So this is basically my main interest. And today I will be talking to you about a general type of methodology I like to use a lot, which is called microgenetic analysis, and it focuses on the study of processes in great detail. So it points a zoom lens on the details of processes and allows you to unpack things that might happen at a very tiny time scale only in interaction, and we like to understand these details through this high zoom factor. Basically, there's been a renaissance in the recent years of introspective first-person approaches. and also second person approaches. I'll get to that. It means dialogical approaches, so using dialogue with people as a method. And I'm not getting into the details here. I'm just sketching the broad lay of the land for you. There's also third person approaches that are microgenetic, and I won't be talking about these at all today. And I'm also personally not invested in these. But there's both kinds, and both are, of course, valid. And I'll be talking about applications to the analysis of skills, of interaction, as well as joint creativity in project on interpersonal synergy, in asking how co-creative trajectories emerge between dancers, for example. And if we have extra time, perhaps a new thing I'm getting interested in currently, which is the study of crafts, how people interact with materials. But let's see how much time we have. Okay. So a bit of broader context about the first person variety of microgenetic process studies. This is related to what psychologists would usually call introspection. So looking into yourself concerning your cognitive processes. And a lot of doubts have been raised in this regard in psychology because this needs to be comprehensive and reliable. So first person reports might not be always, might not be comprehensive or reliable. They can be gappy, biased, and a lot of things people just tell you are quite anecdotal and unsystematic as well. So the question is, how do we overcome these obstacles? And there's a huge debate in psychology as well about introspective methods. I won't go into detail, but this was quite popular around 1900 into the 1920s, and then fell out of favor when the behaviorists came along, and they treated these internal processes as a black box. You probably heard the expression. And then only in the 70s and 80s, new studies cropped up on the validity of verbal reports. And some have argued that, such as Nisbet and Wilson, that verbal reports are not to be trusted. Others have countered that they can be inaccurate, but only when information was requested people didn't actually pay attention to, so they start to make up something they think fitting, and so there's been a very rich debate, and there's quite a lot of different methods associated with the first person aspect, and some of these might be better than others. And I won't go into detail here, but just so that you know, there is no such thing as a single introspective method or first person method in cognitive science. However, I'd like to draw your attention to the obstacles I mentioned. So why can't people simply report what goes on in their minds? Well, for starters, it's very difficult to be comprehensive, because when you report what you're doing, for instance, when you're dancing or crafting, for instance, then you have very little time to report the whole wealth of what happens. A lot more happens than can be said in the same time. And also, very often, consciousness moves on. When we try to stay with the topic, okay, we associate and then we end up elsewhere very quickly in everyday settings. So this is a very basic obstacle when you want to interview people. Yes, I already mentioned the time constraints. So if you use a kind of thinking aloud approach, which is one variety of first person approach, you have people think aloud while they do something, then this is necessarily limited. But there's other methods also that are more retrospective, after the fact, and they might not be as affected by this difficulty. So in addition, there's basic accessibility issues when you think about cognition, because people think subconsciously, perhaps, And when they think about how they think, they might not be able to report accurately what it was or how they did it. And a number of points have been brought up, such as people are prone to omit elements, memory lapses, even false memories can emerge, or you report something from memory, but as you do it, you actually assimilate that to a cultural schema. For instance, there's been famous studies in psychology in the 1930s that people who were given American Indian fairy tales or stories to recall and recount actually assimilated these to the structure of their own cultural fairy tale patterns and came up with the wrong story. And so that's a very typical thing that can happen, and you need safeguards. So another point is that a lot of things might not be accessible to consciousness in the first place. So some of my cognitive science colleagues would say that 90% of cognition lies submerged, like the part of the iceberg you can't see. And there's questions about the role of consciousness for behavior also. Is behavior guided by consciousness? Is consciousness an add-on? So lots of very deep and difficult questions. And in addition to this, there's also the interesting aspect of what's called tacit knowledge, or sometimes embodied knowledge. Polanyi said people typically know more than they can tell. And this is the tacit part of your knowledge, such as if you do some sports, you have automated procedural knowledge, or even your kitchen knowledge, all these little routines and moves, this know-how. It gets hidden away in the body. You produce it automatically, but can you actually report on how you do it? That's a good question you can ask. And philosophers, in addition, would ask, okay, once we ask people to remember a particular experience, can you actually re-access that experience, or is the memory something different from the experience? Does it change? Does memorization or recall change the experience? So lots of things to consider and bear in mind. And in addition, as an interviewer, you're always up against practical distractors as well. So the list doesn't even stop here. People are prone to think associatively. What else comes to mind needs to be mentioned. For example, your other expert knowledge, if you talk to experts. People are prone to telling a good story rather than stick to what actually happened. People are prone to focus on what they want to do and not the means that they use to do it, so they're blind to processes. And people very often move into the general, their declarative knowledge, rather than what specifically happened. So that's food for thought for people who want to use first-person methods, obviously. And there is not no all-in-one solution to all these practical problems and also philosophical problems. But in recent times, people have devoted a lot of energy, especially in France, I should say, that to overcome these obstacles with pragmatically tuned methods that have their own logic, as you will see. So there's this renaissance of the view from within, as a finished publication is called, book. And this goes with the notion of micro-phenomenology mostly, after Pierre Vermeersch and Claire Petit-Mangin in Paris. And these are methods that are used to unpack processes to a high zoom factor. So they don't look at the processes as a psychologist in experiment would, looking at a stimulus and an outcome. They are more interested in what happens in between. And methods are about eliciting memories of a specific incident. So they're always tied to one very specific moment. And they're trying to address what's called the pre-reflexive dimension of this experience. And they've drawn on a lot of other things that have been around, such as neurolinguistic programming techniques called Rogers and Milton Erickson in psychotherapy, theater training, actor studios techniques, mindfulness meditation techniques. And so they've come up with a lot of useful practical tricks of the trade, how to do such interviews from a first-person viewpoint that directly address a very specific experience. And more recently, there's also been crossover approaches such as neurophenomenology. There's a lot of research now in skills in sports, or growing, actually, well, maybe not a lot, but it's growing. And that includes my own work. And finally, I should mention, because this is called phenomenology, it has pretty little to do with academic phenomenology like Husserl's or Scheele's or Heidegger's. So it's just a word for capturing the experience, and the techniques are pretty different. So what happens when we do these kinds of microphenomenological interviews? The basic idea here is to thin slice an event, and I'll be using this tango move or technique as an example. This might take about 3 seconds or so, depending on the speed. And you've all the different slices here and different photos, and a lot happens at each and every of these moments. And you could spend up to 10 minutes or 15 minutes talking about every one of the photos and what happens. What do you, what does your body do exactly? How do you sense the partner? And do that from both angles, because there's 2 partners. Then what happens as you move into the next part of the technique? How do you know the partner is ready? How do you know you are ready yourself? What exactly do you need to do to invite the partner? In the case of the leading dancer, the guy here, he's the leading dancer, and the follower doesn't actually know what's going to happen, so he has to communicate with her, create the right invitation, so this thing will happen as proposed. And you could go deeper at virtually any point into this and spend a lot of time basically dissecting both the action aspects, the perception aspects, the decision aspects. This is extremely rich in itself, even though it takes only a couple of seconds, really, if you're interested in this kind of research question, obviously. So maybe not everybody's interested in going into these technical details, but actually to understand what happens in tango interaction, this can be a very fruitful approach to describe the communication skills, the physical skills, and so forth. Okay, and how do we, by we I mean my own research group here in Vienna, how do we work practically? We've come up with a pretty pragmatic way of researching experts, mainly, who we invite to a workshop-like setting. We have 3.5 hours, perhaps, or 4 hours together. And then we ask them to do something they would normally do, spontaneously, creatively, and look at some variants and some scenes together, and start selecting those that are interesting under some particular angle. They could, depending on the research project, so it could be something particularly interesting, something particularly difficult, and so forth. Or perhaps an interaction failure. So there's various ways of selecting micro moments of interest. And once we've done that together, pardon? Christian?
Yeah, we're here.
I heard something. Was that a question?
No, you're hearing coughing.
Okay.
So you're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. So once we've made this selection together, we start looking at 1 or perhaps 2 or 3 different micro moments of a few seconds length, if it stands. And looking at this particular dance moment that you can see on the right-hand side here. This is contact improvisation. We start to ask the dancers or whoever comes to actually define a timeline and define transition points between different stages of what happens. Give some nice name to each of the stages, and progressively create a kind of timeline that's a bit like a musical score, if you like. And once we've done that, and we have names for the various slices of this event, we zoom in on each of the moments and start asking particular questions, for instance, about what one person perceives in the other person and how this influences their decisions the next moment, and various other questions. So the basic idea here is to take multiple sweeps through the incident, this selected moment, and through these multiple sweeps, build an intensity and enrich its understanding continuously through the dialogue with the experts. And when we do this, we like to use a few special interview techniques, which brings me back to the microphenomenology tradition I mentioned, the guys based in France. And the two photos you can see here are actually Pierre Mersch and Claire Petit-Mangin, who, especially Petit-Mangin, is very active, and if you like to do workshops to learn her methods, I think you will be able to find her online. So in any case, the basic idea here is that it really helps to have another person present, especially a skilled interviewer can help you overcome those obstacles I named in a very powerful way. So the presence of an interviewer, well, yes, we'll get into that, facilitates in different ways, and it's a bit like Socrates and his midwifery method you've probably heard about. So this is the role. The role of the interviewer is the midwife, if you like, to bring forth what's there, but just help in the process. And part of this is to facilitate the recall if it's a retrospective research design. So if you talk about something that's happened in the past, and you can lead the interview into a so-called evocative state where memory comes back to you. There's special techniques for that. And you always like to encourage a mindful and very sensorily grounded modality. So people are very good at remembering things when they remember some sensation, for instance, like in Marcel Proust's famous Madeleine bakery. You probably heard of this famous scene from his books. And the second thing an interview does is to help to stabilize attention on a particular thin slice. Since we've said before, attention is fleeting, it tends to wander, it tends to associate. These are things you don't want, and the interviewer is in charge of arresting attention to this one moment and sticking with the moment, so all the interesting details have time to unfold until some saturation happens. And this might involve leading people back from their associative forays whenever necessary, firmly but politely. And another basic technique here is to not ask directive questions if you can avoid it. So you don't want to put choices to people, like is this or that. You want to help them create little springboards into memories, perhaps, and you don't want to disrupt the inner effort to remember, for instance. So there's A lot more to be said. Yeah, actually, just I had another slide which is invisible now, which I can show you later if we have extra time, about specific techniques. So there's a lot more to be said about how to do explication interviews. It's a skill in its own right, and it takes a lot of time to learn. I'd say it's a practical skill. You learn from others or from being there, and of course, this only scratches the surface. What I've said. So one other thing we've started doing is to use video feedback, also called stimulated recall. So if people are self-confronted with what they did in the workshop, just after it happened on a tablet computer, this enables them to review things in slow motion. They don't need to revoke the memory and spend a lot of effort on that, which frees their cognitive resources, which is helpful if you can do that. And it also really helps to see yourself doing things, because what you see, if you see yourself dancing, for example, this anchors your reports in very specific moments and moves you did, and you can reference your memories to these easily. So you have intersubjectivity cross checks through that with because the video is something that's observable and public. Everybody sees it, so people can start asking, well, did you get the timing right here? Maybe we're talking about a slightly different moment, for example. And of course, it's nice to point out, okay, you might have missed something. Could you talk a bit more about this particular aspect here? And also counteracts this confabulation, the tendency to make up details if you can't remember. And obviously, it allows all these systematic checks from different angles. So it's a very handy and nice tool to have. And something else we started doing, which I am a great believer in actually, is a show and tell modality. You might call it quasi-experimentation, which is something you can't do in every kind of project. But if you have this workshop-based exploration with experts, very often it's really natural for them to actually show you things and show you things with some variations perhaps, and slow things down. And it's a great intuition pump to actually see them do it, as well as an intuition pump for themselves to reaccess the experience of doing it. So this kind of setting has allowed us to explore the influence of changed external constraints. For instance, do the whole thing faster, do it in a restricted space, or telling the partner perhaps try not to go along with it so easily, make it more difficult for your partner. And so there's various different sorry for that. There's various different things you can actually play with, and the basic idea here is to understand the system. It's very good to manipulate it, perhaps also to perturb it, and through these manipulations, you begin to understand the interesting differences. And you can actually ask them to do the same tech. If it's a repeatable dance technique, for example, you could ask them, what's the smallest possible change that would make a different action seem advisable? So if you do this a bit slower, perhaps, or if you change the geometry with the partner, do you still think this is an attractive action to try out? Okay, yeah, you kind of think it's still good. You're still good. You're still in the right range and stuff. But now move a bit further away from the partner. Is it still a good action? Do you need to do something to make it a good action, or do you want to pick a different action instead because it's easier to do if you're an improviser, especially? This is interesting. Okay, so I won't go into all the details here, but one other thing you can do is to review action alternatives, really. So to focus on particular points where a decision needs to be made, and to ask people, okay, what other things might you have done here? things you didn't do, but what else would have been interesting to do? And why didn't you do it? Okay. So this brings to a close my more methodological part of the presentation. And in the remaining time, I'd like to give you a feel for practical applications and some research questions in cognitive interaction research that are interesting to address and that we did address. One thing we're currently working on is the idea of interpersonal synergies, so synergies across the skin boundary that involve multiple persons. So the basic concept comes from motor control theory and focuses on individuals, but it turns out that the concept can also be applied to supra-individual units. And it involves the study of how people coordinate or create coordinative structures from a flexible assembly of different components. And when I say components, this means components from both bodies. So how do these two bodies add components to something larger so that this larger something becomes meaningful and functional also? And what are the particular sharing patterns between these different components? How does one component hook onto the other? And what happens in this whole configuration when there is a slight perturbation, when one component fails? How does the system react to sustain itself? So this is one of the basic ideas of synergy theory, that synergies are these multi-component structures and they're quite flexible. And when something happens, then another part of the system can step in. This can be seen in interesting experiments. For instance, if you block a particular effector of the speech apparatus in an experiment, another part of your speech apparatus will step in fluently and you won't even notice, and you'll produce the same sound. And so this is the kind of reasoning about synergies here. The different components might be slightly different, but the whole and its functionality is what counts. And in our own kind of approach, we like to take stock of the various elements that go into a particular skill and look at their sharing. And to give you a practical example, this is a technique from a partner practice that's called acro yoga, partner acrobatics, you might say. And we're interested in the collective physics here as one research question. So how the physical organization between the bodies is established and expanded as well as regulated. And very often this happens through weight sharing, bone alignment, counterbalance, levers, integrity, stability. In this particular example, this is a two-stage technique. First thing that happens is that the flying dancer, she's actually called the flyer in acro yoga. So the flyer is supported by the base's hands on her shoulders, and they need to align he needs to align the bones of his arms with her internal body structure. So this becomes a self-stabilizing supporting structure that works more through the bones than through the actual muscles. And this can be very stable, but then they do something else that destabilizes the configuration again, and they go into this counterbalance modality. So they destabilize the synergy, but they do something else to restabilize it again, because they, as you can see, she connects one of her hands to the base's knee, and through this they create this very complex counterweight configuration that is also self-stabilizing as long as they both maintain their bodily form. Of course, this doesn't go on indefinitely, but it's something that can be held for a few seconds. So this is the aspect of collective physics. Now, a quite different aspect is the dynamic aspect of what happens over time. And this is an example of an Aikido technique, martial arts. Something on the order of 3, 4, or 5 seconds, you might say. And it turns out there are typical characteristic phases. There is an attack that begins, then one of the two opponents steps in and makes contact before the arm of the attacker actually comes down. So there's this interception moment. And after the interception, a pretty complex technique is applied to the arm of the attacker. And through this, the balance of the attacker is progressively destroyed or broken, up to the point where you can see the torso lying in space parallel to the floor already. And then after this happens, not much needs to be done actually. So the defender can actually shove or give a small impulse to the attacker and guide him to the floor for a ground fixation there. So these are the main phases. And the interesting thing is when you look at Aikido techniques in this way is that there are different typical decision points or zones, you might say, if you look in detail. And these are also the points where something else can happen. So if the timing is slightly different, a different technique can start there, and a wholly different kind of progression unfolds. So this is a very nice way to illustrate what's called path dependency in research. Path dependency means that the stuff that's happened before brings you to a particular moment and to particular options. And so, for instance, if you have a resisting attacker, you can't go on with your technique. You have to pick a different technique that uses what the attacker is giving you, namely the resistance. And then you go on a different path because of that at this particular point along the trajectory. So all sorts of different trajectory bifurcations can be understood in this way. And here's some examples from Tai Chi, which is often just practiced in a cyclic way without actually executing a defensive action, which you can see on top. But on bottom, you can also see how one partner actually shoves the other away, which then kind of starts flying through the air. Quite interesting pattern. So both kinds of practice are real. So people often practice cyclic patterns, but also breaking the cycle. And in Tai Chi, the interesting techniques are to maintain this connection to the partner, connect your structure, your own body structure into the partner's structure, while not answering force with counter force, and while also concealing to a certain extent hidden preparations of your body. So for instance, when your feet already get into a position that's ready for shoving the partner might not notice this because if you elongate your arm, which is what the partner can feel, the partner can't feel your feet directly, can only feel the arms and hands. And if the arms do this deceptive elongation maneuver, then the partner might be fooled into doing something going too far, coming too far forward, so they can actually be pushed. And I won't be going into the details here. It's just for illustrating this path dependency notion once again. We just talked about it a little bit. And we've come up with some quite fancy models of different scenarios that can unfold, which I also won't go into in great detail here, just to show you different bifurcations in this kind of interaction. So there can be initial attack, then there can be a symmetric counterattack to the last transition point. And then various different things can happen from the viewpoint of the guy on the left. So the guy on the left can take advantage of some informational over-encouragement of the opponent, kind of lead him on in the way I described before through the elongated hands. There can also be a physically induced over-encouragement to come too far through a particular micro-intervention that makes them unstable. And there can also be a simple exploitation of not so good timing in the attack or without doing extra stuff. So it always depends on how well configured they both are. And if the attacker isn't so well configured, there might be openings for pushing them directly. Okay, and I won't go into all these other variants because I guess you understood the basic message here, which is just the analysis of different micro scenarios and their bifurcation points. So here's a quite different kind of research question. We've been interested in joint creativity or co-creation, and there's authors in creativity studies who've argued that creativity isn't necessarily only mind-bound or even only organism-bound, but actually something that happens in a distributed way over brain-body ecology. This is just another way of saying what I've said before about synergies, of course. So creativity can be a synergy across bodies as well. And other authors have reclaimed intuitivity-based cognition as one of the basic principles of creativity and also problem solving, that not everything happens through thinking, but also through active engagement in the world, which can be really productive. So if you strategically explore, manipulate, or stimulate feedback, this can really help you solve problems, and it can also help you come up with something really new together. In other words, be creative together. And these kinds of claims are quite strong claims in cognitive science, obviously, because we usually think about cognition as being mind-bound. So if you want to do, if you want to support this kind of claim, microgenetic approaches really useful. And I'll show you an example here. So with the video. This is context improvisation dancing. I'll show you this several times. Oh, sorry. Here we go again. So what you see here is an inverted left that happens quite spontaneously and from a position none of the dancers had previously tried out before. It's not that inverted lifts are something completely out of the ordinary for the dancers, but the way it happened was pretty extraordinary here. And what happens is the male dancer is kind of teetering on the female dancer's shoulders, and she drops sideways and creates this interesting configuration with her neck in his lap. And I'll show you this on the I'll show you this as a screenshot because it's easier to see. So this is 1.2. This
Michael, we got about 5 minutes left. So yeah, 5 minutes.
Yeah. I'm good with that. Yeah. Okay. I can make this my last example actually. And the thing that happens here is she creates this fulcrum, a potential fulcrum through her neck and his lap, and starts thinking, well, that could be an interesting way to get my feet into the air. And he sees the potential as well. They haven't spoken about this, or they have no idea what's going to happen, both of them. They're just making it up as they go along. But he senses there's this fulcrum, and she starts to go into an inverted position. And as she does that, he starts to help her quite spontaneously as well by grabbing her and sitting backwards, so as to create a certain pull on her body, so as to make it easier. And through this assistance, her legs actually leave the ground. And as this happens, he supports her even more. They sense, okay, we can go on from here, we can go even higher. And in the end, they create this inverted lift and stabilize it for a moment before returning to the ground. And this is precisely this co-creation through material dynamics that that theorists predict. So it's nothing anybody has made up. It's nothing. It can't be even assigned to one person or the other person. It happens in the real-time dynamics through something you might call mutual scaffolding, mutual providing of possibilities, and so they kind of scaffold each other up until something creative happens. Yeah, these are other examples I can't go into.
Okay, sorry, Michael, we're running a little bit behind schedule here. So
yeah,
first of all, if everyone in the room would just want to give him a big hand, because that was super duper interesting. So time really flies when you're having fun, right? So sorry we lost track of time here, but that was really fascinating. So I think we might only have time for one question, maybe one question or two questions. So if anyone in the room wants to start off with a question, or if anyone online has a question, here's your opportunity. So I'll let my moderator check for online questions.
And Joe has a question.
Zach, thanks for sharing. What evidence is there that this microgenetic approach overcomes the problems and pitfalls you cited at the start of the presentation?
Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer, actually, because it depends on the standards you judge it by. So for an experimental psychologist, I'd say they might never be completely convinced, but you simply need to look at the studies and what you can get out of them in terms of descriptive rigor and amount of detail. That would be my answer. If you are interested in the methodology debate, there's a couple of interesting papers as well on that from the Petit Mangin crowd. But I guess this wasn't the actual question, was it? Or was it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that sounds accurate. So just in the interest of time, one more time, thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate it. You guys have maybe 5 minutes to catch some air, quick coffee if you need, and then we'll jump right into Barbara. So thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.